In 1945, as Berlin burned, one man simply disappeared. While Allied forces closed in and the Third Reich crumbled into dust, SS officer Heinrich Vogel slipped quietly into the chaos and was never seen again. His last recorded sighting placed him near the Austrian border, wearing a civilian coat, carrying a forged travel pass, and accompanied by two men whose identities were never confirmed. When the war ended, Vogel's name appeared among the thousands listed as presumed dead. But almost immediately, the whispers began. He hadn't died in the ruins of Germany, they said. He had escaped. Vogel had been a logistics officer for the Waffen-SS, a man of meticulous planning and cold precision. Those who worked with him described him as methodical, patient, and unnervingly calm, even in catastrophe. As the war turned against Germany, Vogel was transferred to Salzburg under orders to secure sensitive materials for the Reich's Southern Command. What those materials were has never been revealed, but by April of 1945, he was gone vanished between the collapsing front lines and the high mountain passes of Austria. In the years that followed, Allied investigators combed through Nazi archives, hunting for any trace of Vogel's fate. Nothing. His body was never recovered, his grave never marked. Yet, strange reports began to surface. A man matching his description, seen boarding a Red Cross convoy in Italy. Another sighting at a safe house near the Spanish border. And a third, far stranger, from a dockworker in Genoa, who swore he saw a man with Vogel's pale blue eyes boarding a freighter bound for South America. For the world, the war had ended. But for a small network of men like Heinrich Vogel, it was only the beginning. In the ashes of defeat, a new mission was quietly taking shape, a plan to vanish, to survive, and to rebuild in the shadows. Later it would be called by one name that still carries a chill: Operation Silence. The war was over, but the ghosts of the Reich were already on the move. Hidden beneath the surface of post-war Europe, an underground network began smuggling SS officers, scientists, and collaborators out of the continent. Its whispered name was Odessa, a secret lifeline for the architects of a dead empire. Through Italy's broken ports and Spain's sympathetic harbors, false identities were forged, documents stamped, and safe passage bought with gold looted from the ruins of Germany. The routes became known as rat lines, pathways that led not toward judgment, but toward reinvention. Ships departed from Genoa, Venice, and Cadiz under false manifests, their passengers listed as technicians or refugees. Their destinations: Buenos Aires, Santiago, Montevideo. South America became their sanctuary, its dense jungles and new governments fertile ground for those who wished to disappear. Among the names whispered in intelligence circles during the late 1942 was one that kept resurfacing: Hans Vollmer, a German engineer living modestly in Genoa, tall, with a scar along his jaw. British intelligence believed Vollmer was an alias for Vogel. An intercepted letter, written in cautious, coded phrasing, spoke of friends in the colonies and work that must continue. Yet by the time agents arrived, the apartment was empty, no forwarding address, no trace of where he'd gone. Locals said a man matching Vollmer's description boarded a cargo ship called Santa Lucia on a humid June morning in 1949. Its destination: Buenos Aires. Passenger lists were altered, records later lost to fire. All that remained was a single customs entry, marked with 2 words: no inspection. After that, Vogel, if it was him, was never seen again. And so, like so many who fled across the Atlantic, he vanished into rumor, reborn in silence, leaving behind only questions that would echo for generations. By 1950, the world had begun to rebuild, and the ashes of war were slowly being swept away. But in quiet corners of Europe, a handful of men and women refused to forget. They were the investigators of Interpol's fledgling war crimes division, tired, overworked, but relentless. Among the names on their lists was one that always seemed to lead nowhere: Heinrich Vogel. His file was thin: one photograph, a handful of army records, and a few interrogation notes from captured officers who claimed he had gone south. They searched archives in Munich and Vienna, requested manifests from Italian ports, even interviewed priests who'd issued false baptismal certificates to men seeking new identities. Every lead collapsed into contradiction. One witness swore Vogel had drowned, crossing into Switzerland. Another insisted he'd been executed by Soviet forces near Prague. A third described a Captain Vogel living peacefully in a monastery near Seville, only for the trail to end in yet another dead man, another wrong face. The deeper they dug, the more the evidence seemed to disappear. Files went missing. Reports were misplaced. Testimonies redacted or destroyed. Some investigators began to suspect someone was quietly protecting Vogel, scrubbing his paper trail clean. By 1957, his name was officially removed from the most wanted registry. The world, it seemed, had moved on. Families of his victims pleaded for answers that never came. Memorials were built, photographs framed, and history began to settle into uneasy silence. Vogel likely perished in the chaos of war. Read the final Interpol memo. It was easier to believe that he was dead, another ghost lost to the ruins of Europe, than to imagine he might still be out there. And for a while, the world did believe that. Until, decades later, a discovery in a dusty attic would shatter that certainty forever. It began with an attic in Hamburg. In 1972, historian Klaus Reinhardt was cataloging the estate of a deceased industrialist, a man who had once supplied materials to the German army. Amid stacks of invoices and rusted trunks, he found a small tin box wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Inside were letters, bound with twine and stained by time. Most were mundane receipts, correspondence from business partners, but three stood out. They were postmarked Buenos Aires, 1951, and each was signed with the same initials, HV. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, Germanic in its precision. The first letter spoke of a new life in the colonies and of friends among the old order. The second described land purchased beyond the city, where the air is dense and the trees never end. The third was shorter, almost poetic, and far darker. The jungle accepts all who wish to disappear. It read. There were no addresses, no names, but the tone, confident, nostalgic, and faintly paranoid, was unmistakably that of a man used to command. Reinhardt contacted the authorities, who confirmed the stamps were authentic, printed in Argentina during the early Perón years. For investigators, it was the first concrete evidence in nearly 3 decades that Heinrich Vogel, or whoever he had become, had survived the war and built a new life half a world away. But the letters also carried a sense of unease, as if their author was writing not just to report his safety, but to warn someone else still hiding. And beneath the closing words of the final letter, scrawled faintly in pencil, was a phrase that no one could quite decipher, something about the fortress in the green. It would take another 40 years before anyone understood what that meant. Stories have a way of surviving even when facts fade. In the borderlands between Paraguay and northern Argentina, the locals still talk about the man with the scar. He was tall, pale, with a streak of white through his hair and a faint accent no one could quite place. He arrived sometime in the early 1952s, traveling with crates of tools and lumber, escorted by men who kept to themselves. He told people his name was Senor Vollmer, and that he had come to farm the land, but he never sold crops, never hired workers, and rarely left the jungle. What he did have was gold small coins, stamped with eagles and unfamiliar markings. He paid for everything in cash, often overpaying, as if to discourage questions. Those who ventured near his property spoke of a massive wooden house hidden behind walls of thick green vines and palm trees, a structure far too elaborate for a simple farmer. The locals called it La Fortaleza, the fortress. At night, strange lights flickered between the trees, and on certain mornings, villagers said they heard engines overhead, small aircraft circling low, landing on the cleared field behind the house. Some claimed uniformed men came and went, carrying briefcases and boxes wrapped in oilcloth. Others swore they heard German voices echoing through the valley when the wind was right. For nearly a decade, Senor Volmer remained an enigma. Polite, but distant. Generous, but secretive. Children dared each other to sneak close to the property, returning with tales of armed guards and the faint smell of burning chemicals. Then, one night in 1959, the lights of La Fortaleza went dark. The planes stopped coming. Smoke rose briefly above the canopy, and by dawn, the house was silent. When locals finally approached days later, the gates hung open, the air heavy with ash. Inside, the compound was deserted. No bodies, no luggage, no sign of struggle, just silence. The man with the scar was gone, as if he had never existed at all. Time buried La Fortaleza beneath its own legend. The jungle swallowed the paths, trees broke through concrete, and memories faded into myth. Decades passed before the world heard of it again. In 2013, an agricultural surveyor named Diego Pereira was mapping state-owned land near the Paraguayan border when his drone footage caught something unusual. Straight lines in a place where nature made only curves. He trekked out the next day, machete in hand, and found the remains of an enormous structure hidden under decades of overgrowth. Vines clung to collapsed beams, and beneath the moss lay walls made of reinforced concrete, unusual in a region where homes were built from wood or clay. Scattered among the debris were fragments of porcelain stamped "Made in Bavaria," a broken radio transmitter, and a rusted Mercedes staff car with its insignia carefully filed off. The discovery drew archaeologists, then journalists, then men in unmarked vehicles who ordered everyone off-site. Within a week, the area was sealed. The official explanation claimed the ruins were a colonial-era estate of no historical significance. But those who had seen the photographs whispered otherwise. The materials were too modern, the layout too precise, the insignia too familiar. Someone had built a fortress in the jungle, a place designed not to be found. News spread quietly through the towns along the Paraná River. The Nazi jungle house has been found. And though the government denied it, everyone knew the story of the man with the scar. Some said he'd been a war criminal. Others, a fugitive priest or scientist. But when asked his real name, the oldest villagers always gave the same answer. Spoken softly, as if afraid the forest might still be listening. Vogel. By 2015, the rumors had grown too loud to ignore. The story of the hidden fortress, deep in the South American jungle, had reached Buenos Aires, where it caught the attention of the National Institute of Anthropology. Within months, a small team led by Dr. Emilia Soria set out on an expedition to verify what locals had whispered about for generations. Their journey took them through miles of tangled undergrowth, past rivers that glowed orange at dusk and valleys where the air itself seemed to hum with heat. When they reached the site, what they saw was unlike anything they had expected. Massive stone foundations jutted from the soil, covered in moss and strangler fig. A collapsed staircase led down into what appeared to be an underground storage area. Scattered through the debris were artifacts unmistakably European in origin. porcelain marked with the seal of a German manufacturer, rusted cutlery stamped with eagle insignia, and coins bearing the year 1943. Dr. Soria described the scene as frozen in time. Among the vines they found sealed green wine bottles dated to the same year, their corks still intact, the labels written in Old Gothic script. Nearby, fragments of a radio transmitter and a box of syringes wrapped in decayed gauze hinted that this place had not just been a residence, it had been a base. The most startling find, however, came from beneath a pile of bricks in what had once been the study. A small iron safe, its hinges fused shut with rust. The archaeologist carried it out carefully, brushing away the decades of soil that clung to it like a shroud. News of the discovery spread almost instantly. Headlines around the world screamed the same phrase: "Lost Nazi hideout, found in South American jungle." The photos showed smiling archaeologists standing beside the half-buried ruins, but beneath the excitement ran a darker question. Who had built this place? And what had they been hiding that warranted a safe sealed in steel and secrecy for more than 70 years? The safe was opened in Buenos Aires under controlled conditions. After days of careful cleaning, technicians finally cracked it open, releasing a stale gust of air that hadn't seen daylight since the 1950 seconds. Inside were objects that turned rumor into reality. Several passports lay stacked together, their covers brittle with age. Each carried a different name and nationality: Hans Vollmer, Heinrich Faber, Johann Keller, but the photographs were of the same man. Tall, sharp, featured, with the faint scar along his jaw. Beneath the passports was a collection of black and white photographs, showing a man in SS uniform standing beside a large wooden house, the same structure, now half devoured by the jungle. Another photograph showed him seated at a desk beside two other men, both wearing medals of the Totenkopf division. Folded neatly beneath the photos was a small, leather-bound diary. The pages were brittle, written in cramped German shorthand, interspersed with strange symbols, half code, half scripture. When linguists began to decode it, the entries grew increasingly cryptic. Vogel or Vollmer wrote of the Brothers of the Sun, a clandestine circle devoted to preserving what he called the flame of the Reich. He described shipments arriving from the north, experiments in the Green Chamber, and frequent visits from pilgrims of the order. The final entry carried a single line, scrawled in hurried ink: "The new Reich will rise not in stone or flag, but in the shadows of those who remember." For Dr. Soria, it was no longer a dig. It was an exhumation of history itself. Every artifact told the same story. Heinrich Vogel had survived the war, escaped to the jungles of South America, and built a sanctuary for men who believed the Third Reich had never truly ended. The findings from the safe ignited a wave of global scrutiny, and what began as an archaeological expedition soon evolved into a criminal investigation spanning continents. Old intelligence files were reopened, and a disturbing thread began to emerge, one that linked Vogel not just to his jungle hideout, but to one of the darkest secrets of post-war South America. Deep in the mountains of southern Chile lay Colonia Dignidad, a German settlement founded in the 1960s under the guise of a charitable mission. To the outside world, it was a religious commune, a place of order and piety. In truth, it was a fortress, a walled compound ruled by former Nazi medic Paul Schaefer, where unspeakable acts were carried out under the banner of discipline and faith. When Argentine investigators cross-referenced the coded entries from Vogel's diary with declassified Chilean intelligence reports, the overlap was undeniable. Shipments listed as agricultural equipment were traced to Colonia Dignidad. Bank records showed funds wired from a defunct Buenos Aires account once belonging to Hans Vollmer. More unsettling still were the testimonies of former residents who had since fled the colony. Several remembered a visitor they called Kapitan Hans, a stern, uniformed man with a scar along his jaw who inspected the grounds and lectured about unfinished work. One survivor recalled how the man spoke of the purity of the bloodline and the rebirth of order. Another described him as calm, polite, like a priest who had seen hell and wanted to rebuild it. When shown photographs recovered from the safe, all of them pointed to the same face: Heinrich Vogel. But the evidence remained circumstantial. Fragments of memory and paper half-burned by time. Officials hesitated to declare it proof. The world, after all, had learned to doubt the extraordinary. Yet, as investigators pieced the puzzle together, one thing became clear. Vogel's influence had not died in the jungle. It had spread quietly, deliberately through the colonies of exile. And somewhere in that blur of religion, science, and secrecy, his vision of a new Reich in the shadows had taken root. When Dr. Soria's team returned to the site later that year, they focused on a section of the ruins previously thought to be storage. Beneath collapsed beams and rotted timber, they found a stairway descending into the earth. At the bottom was a narrow room lined with tiled walls and rusted tables. What they discovered there transformed the legend of Vogel from myth into horror. Glass beakers lay shattered across the floor. Microscopes, surgical tools, and chemical flasks, labeled in German, had fused into lumps of corrosion. In one corner sat a generator marked Siemens 1942, its cables snaking into the concrete like veins. On the wall hung a chalkboard covered in faded equations and anatomical sketches. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like an abandoned medical lab. To Dr. Soria, it was unmistakably something else, a place of experimentation. Local villagers, emboldened by the discovery, began to share the stories their parents had once whispered. During the 1,950 seconds, they said, strange lights flickered above the trees at night, and animals were found mutilated near the riverbanks. Some spoke of workers who went missing after being hired to clear the jungle. Others recalled a sickness that swept through a nearby village, fevers that burned for days, followed by sudden silence. The symptoms matched no known disease. Among the debris, the team recovered glass vials, etched with serial numbers identical to those used in wartime Germany's biomedical research. Samples were sent to forensic labs. The results were inconclusive but chilling. Whatever had happened in that underground chamber had not been simple science. Dr. Soria refused to speculate publicly, but in private, she confessed her fear that Heinrich Vogel had not merely been hiding from justice. He had been continuing his work experiments born in the ashes of the Reich, perfected in the silence of the jungle. The forest had concealed his crimes for decades, but now, at last, it seemed to whisper their secrets back to the world. In early 2017, the story that had long been confined to archives and archaeology suddenly became personal. In Berlin, a 6-7-year-old woman named Clara Vogel received a call that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. The voice on the other end belonged to an Argentine journalist working with international investigators. DNA testing, he explained carefully, had linked her to bone fragments discovered near La Fortaleza. Clara listened in silence, the words settling like dust on old memories. Her father, she said, had been a diplomat who disappeared when she was 6 years old. His name was Heinrich Vogel, though her mother had long insisted it was an unfortunate coincidence with a different man of the same name. Growing up in post-war Germany, Clara had learned not to ask questions. There were photographs in her childhood home, grainy images of her father in tailored suits, never in uniform, always smiling. But there were shadows too. Visits from men who spoke quietly in the kitchen, a locked trunk in the attic, a mother who would change the subject whenever the war was mentioned. As she grew older, Clara began to suspect that her family's story had been rewritten. Her mother had told neighbors he'd died in an accident abroad. Yet every few years, a letter would arrive without a return address typed. Impersonal. Signed only, H. They stopped in 1959. The same year, the lights of La Fortaleza went dark. When the journalists asked whether she believed her father had escaped Germany, Clara hesitated. "I think he ran from something," she finally said. "But maybe not just from the war, maybe from himself." She agreed to provide additional DNA, though her voice trembled when she spoke of the results. "If it is him, I need to know," she whispered. "Because I've spent my whole life wondering if the blood in my veins belongs to a good man or to a monster." In that moment, the legend of Heinrich Vogel ceased to be just a historical mystery. It became the story of a daughter forced to confront the unbearable truth that evil can live not only in history books, but in the quiet corners of a family's past. Months after the safe's discovery, linguists in Munich finally succeeded in decoding the last section of Vogel's diary. What emerged was a portrait of a man unraveling part confession, part manifesto. The early entries were clinical, filled with notes about logistics, funding, and coded references to the brothers and the order. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. The confident officer who had once written of rebuilding the Reich now spoke in fragments of guilt, of voices in the trees, of dreams where the faces of the dead followed him into the jungle. He wrote of a purified future, a world reborn through discipline and pain. Yet his words were stained with desperation. There were mentions of the mountain vault, a place he described as where the treasure of the fatherland sleeps beneath the green. Investigators believed this might refer to a hidden cache of Nazi gold, long rumored to have vanished at the war's end, perhaps buried somewhere near the Paraguayan border. But the diary's final pages turned from obsession to terror. His handwriting grew jagged, the lines collapsing into chaos. The final entry, dated August 12, 1959, read only, "They are coming. I see the torches among the trees." After that, nothing. No closing signature, no trace of where he went. The ink trailed off mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Forensic testing confirmed the ink matched the same formula used in Germany during the 1,940 seconds, proof that Vogel had clung to the tools of his old life until the very end. To Dr. Soria, the diary was more than evidence. It was a window into a mind consumed by its own ideology. "He fled a country," she told reporters. "But he never escaped the world he built inside himself." Somewhere between faith and fear, Heinrich Vogel vanished again. This time not into the jungle, but into history's most haunting silence. For decades, the official story ended in silence. But in a small municipal archive in Misiones province, a forgotten report revealed one final glimpse into Vogel's fate. It was dated May 1961. A single page filed under Unverified Incident. According to local witnesses, a massive fire had broken out deep in the jungle, near the old river trail. The glow was visible for miles, painting the night sky a dull orange. One farmer claimed he heard shouting in German, followed by short bursts that sounded like gunfire. Another said he saw figures running through the trees, carrying torches, their voices echoing through the humid air. The next morning, a patrol was sent to investigate, but they found only ash. The trees were blackened and twisted, the clearing reduced to smoldering embers. There was no structure left standing, no sign of the fortress locals once called La Fortaleza. What they did find was a scatter of burned paper's ashes clinging to half-melted metal bindings. And, strangely, footprints leading away from the ruins. They trailed off after a few hundred meters, disappearing into the forest, where the undergrowth grew thick and the light dimmed to green twilight. The patrol reported the event to their superiors, but the file was never pursued. There were no official victims, no ownership records for the land, and no reason to investigate a blaze in a place the government didn't even acknowledge existed. Within a week, the incident was forgotten, buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. Yet to those who lived nearby, it became part of local folklore. They said the fire was punishment, that the jungle had reclaimed what did not belong to man. Others believed something or someone had come for Vogel that night. Decades later, the villagers would still point toward the hills and whisper that the forest had swallowed the fortress whole, along with the man who built it. In 2019, long after the world had stopped searching, two hikers cutting through the dense canopy of northern Argentina stumbled upon something extraordinary. They had strayed from the marked path, following the faint outline of a stone wall protruding from the earth. Beneath a layer of moss and vines, they uncovered the entrance to a narrow chamber carved directly into the hillside. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying the metallic tang of decay. At first, they thought it might be an old mine or a wartime bunker. But when their flashlights swept across the floor, the beam caught the unmistakable shape of a human skeleton. The figure lay half-collapsed against the wall, still draped in the remnants of fabric long turned to dust. On one bony hand glimmered a tarnished silver ring engraved with the insignia of the SS. Beside it, fragments of a leather-bound notebook clung together by rusted clasps. The pages were mostly destroyed, but a few symbols and words were legible, identical to those in the coded diary found years earlier. Authorities were called, and within days, forensic teams arrived from Buenos Aires. Using dental analysis and genetic testing against samples provided by Clara Vogel, the results confirmed the unthinkable. The remains belonged to Heinrich Vogel. The SS officer officially declared dead in 1945. He had survived the fall of Berlin, crossed oceans, built a fortress in the jungle, and died alone decades later, beneath the canopy that had once hidden him. The chamber was sealed after the investigation, its exact location withheld from the public. Forensic photographs showed the skeleton still clutching the rusted metal casing of a pistol, pointed downward, as if it had been his choice to end the silence. For historians, it was the final chapter of a mystery that had spanned generations. But for those who knew the legend, it was something else entirely, proof that even in the most remote corners of the world, the past never truly stays buried. In the end, the truth was both simpler and darker than anyone imagined. Heinrich Vogel escaped the war, but not himself. He crossed oceans, changed names, and built walls of jungle and silence around his life. Yet the ghosts he carried followed him into the green. His fortress became his refuge, then his cage. The ideals he once served, the empire he sought to preserve, all crumbled to dust long before he drew his final breath. What endured was isolation, a man consumed by the very shadows he thought he could command. When archaeologists and investigators pieced together the fragments of his story, they found not the legacy of a mastermind, but the remains of a man who had spent decades fleeing from the echo of his own sins. The vines that strangled La Fortaleza were not just nature reclaiming the past, they were history's quiet verdict, a slow, relentless erasure of the darkness he left behind. Vogel's end, somewhere between confession and collapse, stands as a reminder of how evil rarely dies in the open. It recedes, burrows deep, and waits. Sometimes it hides in the ruins of forgotten places. Sometimes in the lines of a diary. And sometimes it lingers in bloodlines and memories, shaping those who never asked to inherit it. For Clara Vogel, the discovery brought no comfort, only clarity. Her father had lived long enough to vanish twice, once from the world and once from the person he had been. His final silence was not redemption, only surrender. The jungle had taken him, and in doing so, It had kept its secret for more than half a century. When investigators finally sealed the site, the trees closed in again, the sound of cicadas rising like a chorus over the ruins. The fortress was gone, the story complete. But the questions it left behind would echo far beyond the forest. Because history, like the jungle, never forgets. It waits, patient and indifferent, for those who think they can outrun it. And in the end, it always finds them. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.